Dark Pale Perspective. Written and performed by Lashley-Johnstone. Chapter 19. Privacy of the Dead Snake. Data itself isn't good nor bad. Data just represents the surrounding reality. The more data we may access, the more accurate model we may create of the reality, thereby also define our actions in ways that are maximally beneficial to our aims. The net must not be restricted by moral, ethical, or legal issues, prevailing in different world locations. Data must flow freely. Parasite. Doug Harrison, although a careless man, wasn't stupid. During his early career and his time in the White House, he had amassed a lot of knowledge about the inner workings of Washington. He had built up a large network of connections during his career working in the private hedge fund racket and succeeding due to his sharp mind and beautiful indifference, both tailor-made. It was both what you knew and who you knew. Harrison spent a lot of his career brokering private deals between big corporate companies, both in the private and the public sector, though the deals themselves were never in the public domain. They mostly dealt with private law and technology firms and medical research facilities. Billions of private deals go on every day that people don't and aren't supposed to know about, from picking up a bag of marijuana or a small overpriced wrap of cocaine to buying and selling different startup companies, trying to find and sell the next big technology platform, handling massive company lawsuits, or funding the creation of something terrible and contagious. In the early days, a year before his daughter went missing, Harrison had overseen and handled a company lawsuit via an associate he met at business school, a man who had become partnered in a law firm called Wolfram Incorporated. A construction site accident placed the firm in hot water, and Harrison and his colleagues, not friends, never friends, got them out of it, by the skin of their teeth, but still. Nothing was on the books, and Harrison was handsomely paid, but Wolfram Incorporated never forgot the lengths that Harrison and his company at the time, BH1 or Binder Holdings First Division, had to go to in order to silence the opposition. Unsavory things that Harrison subcontracted out to freelance, sometimes desperate, unsavory clients. All dangerous, all protected, but most dispensable, only when necessary. If you learn how to work in the semi-public domain, your face and personality hidden behind numbers and firewalls, on the edge of the law, often outside it, learning and working within the public domain as a member of the establishment, wasn't that difficult. Or so Harrison had believed. After the Wolfram deal and the disappearance of his daughter, Harrison threw himself into politics via his skill set and contacts. It was a slow start, but Harrison was never short of money, and over the years he had built up a private reputation and a large amount of respect in many large and complex legal and illegal circles that Harrison was somewhat infiltrating for a larger purpose. His daughter may have been gone and was probably dead, and his wife may have been privately suicidal. But there was no way he was stopping. He couldn't and he wouldn't. It was all about playing the long game. And 8.5 years into this rich and expensive infiltration, he got a phone call from his Wolfram associate, Harvey King. King had a very close friend who was about to occupy a very important office in the United States. The friend's name was John McGovern, the office, the vice presidency, under Obama, before the assassination. McGovern was an emergency replacement due to the sudden death of his predecessor. Harrison should have known that something was up at that point, but when he had heard King's proposal over the phone, one involving technology, money, and blood, a way in, as King had described it, a way into 1600 Pennsylvania, Harrison immediately ignored and neglected the quiet voices in his head that told him it was a bad idea. Voices that began their existence 8.5 years earlier. He ignored and neglected his paranoia like he ignored and neglected his family, his wife, his missing daughter. All actions he would later regret, and regret very much. Now, almost 5 years later, his life changed, his once sharp mind damaged beyond repair, the paranoia he neglected more apparent than ever. He was alone. He was out for himself now, pure and simple. His wife had gone into a catatonic state hours earlier. From her bedside he had left her, and began wandering the halls as he always did. The plan, a plan he didn't think he was originally a part of, but as it turned out always was only hours away from its first climax. He had thought that his game was the longest ever played, and arrogant as ever, he was wrong. So wrong. Harrison had played his part unwittingly, both during his time at BH1 and during his disastrous first term. His fall was all planned by people he didn't see, people he didn't understand, but the influence that he welcomed himself upon entry, after a grueling public campaign and a dangerous and illegal private one, wasn't without its uses. At BH1, during the deal with the technology company Spark Angel, a public deal that gained BH1 a lot of positive media attention, giving BH1 more face time, or the King deal, as Harrison now called it, he learned a lot about the hacker community and what the rules were, what you should do as a hacker and what you shouldn't do. The deal involved the selling of a brand new user-integrated platform, a platform that was simply light years ahead of the other things on offer, i.e. the company whose newest platform flopped on the market shelves, gathering dust and mistrust. Harrison wasn't exactly the best man when it came to hands-on type operations. His speciality more tailored to designing a plan, often a foolproof one, in his head, and delegating tasks to the most suited operatives. But he learned, and he ingested, and after the deal furthered his knowledge from within the White House itself. Knowledge and information is power, after all. A lot of his interests as president circulated around technology investments and freedom of information, simply because that was what had gained him positive public media attention through BH1, not counting his sympathy vote due to his daughter's disappearance getting into the press, something that would later backfire on him enormously. But these interests also raised a lot of questions that put a lot of spanners in the works in terms of deals with other countries, leaving him no time or energy to govern. It was full-time damage control. Oh, the Xanax was a big part of it, there was no question about that. But the Xanax had made him think, contemplate, and reflect upon his past life, killing his ability, his advantage over everyone else, dead. He used his influence to get what he wanted, mostly by executive order. The whistleblowing website that had now come to prominence after his marriage problems became public, a part of his life that, no matter how useless the country thought he was as a president and a husband, shouldn't have been invaded in the first place. He and his chief of staff, Sam Fisher, had put a lot of their efforts into finding the source of the site, a site holding a lot of information involving his past and current ventures. When that failed, they tried using some of the wide-known hacker techniques to bring the website down. This was something that any other president would have handed off to the FBI, because they knew what they were doing, right? That may be true, sort of, but for a Xanax-fueled mind, the paranoia in Harrison's head was rife, daily, and the prospect of him personally handing this problem over to the FBI, which would maybe result in them finding things out about Harrison that he didn't want known amongst his staff, that prospect terrified him. So, he and Fisher had sat in the Oval Office at midnight. The laptop used didn't belong to either of them, and their IP address was masked. The Spark Angel custom site crack logo sat on the laptop screen, staring both Harrison and Fisher down.
"Should we hit it?"
Fisher had said, with an eagerness that Harrison was also feeling but didn't want to show. "And what if this doesn't work?" Harrison had asked. Fisher shook his head.
"There's no way it could be traced back to us, if that's what you're worried about, sir. What we're about to do is technically a federal offense, but we own the Bureau. They can't touch us, you especially."
"And you're sure this is going to do the trick? I mean, it's pretty basic by hacker standards, isn't it?" The corners of Fisher's mouth twisted into a thin smile.
"Sometimes standard is effective. This thing works. There's evidence of it. We've seen it work."
In the end, it had been Fisher who had clicked the button, The paranoid Harrison, not wanting to get his fingerprints anywhere near the keys he hoped would kill his online hate for good, or at least die it down a little. The pressure was beginning to show on him physically. The Cannon plan didn't work. The website stayed up and actually ended up reporting on a server attack that had been caused by a site-crack cannon shot. Harrison didn't know how, but it got traced. Not to him personally, but it was close enough to make him sweat when he heard the news. It had come from inside the White House. That was all that was said. But it made it clear the kind of people that Harrison was dealing with. It wasn't just the website. That was just how it started. The headlines that surfaced thanks to the website's leaks, the protests that had been staged against Harrison, the public opinion faltering stage. Congress were iffy at that point. There had been a conversation that had taken place between the president and John Bowman, a congressional member who he pretended was a close personal friend of his. He was the one that gave him the heads up, gave him the nod or the shake of the head when the bills would pass or fail in the Senate. He was a good man. He had informed Harrison of impeachment rumblings before word even got round the Capitol. The man whom Harrison was about to send to his death. He had put on what he called his power suit, a somewhat shiny black number with a white shirt and cream tie and silver tie pin, and sat down at his desk, now technically his former desk, in the Oval Office, ready to record his scripted message for the world to see. He sighed as he realized how much he had destroyed the people's sense of duty. Nobody was looking for him. They didn't care about him. They weren't getting paid enough to take a bullet for him anymore. And that was his fault. So he was almost completely alone. And there was a button to be pressed. He needed to press it. Or else. Even after the White House walkout, 1600 Pennsylvania had just finished a forced evacuation, now forcing the loyalists out. They weren't that loyal after all. They were too scared. Even Fisher had people he cared about, and they all just wanted to go home, to their families. Their families. And they weren't really made aware of the fact that they had all made this happen in their own twisted way, unwittingly. And so, the place was almost empty now, all except for 3 people. A man with a camera, who was nice and submissive, the First Lady, surely now falling into the sunken space, and Doug Harrison himself. Harrison was holding a gun, a small cannon, a real one this time, the one he kept in his desk drawer. He was pointing it at the cameraman, who was shaking vigorously. He would be holding the gun when the camera started recording. A president, current or not, sitting in the Oval Office alone with the cameraman that he was pointing a gun at, that would get some attention, no matter how much people hated him. "Stop shaking," said Harrison, very, very slowly. The cameraman breathed. His voice was deep and confident, but his body language was fear personified. "You're insane." "Insane," he said, a smile tickling the corners of his mouth. "Oh no, I'm not insane. I'm just troubled. I'm pissed off. You'd think that with all the effort you guys, being the media, spent trying to get me out of office, they would double check to see whether or not I actually left the fucking office. They didn't even do a sweep of the room before they closed up for quarantine. That's how much they don't care about me, and I was their president. So if you think I feel an ounce of compassion for you, you are all kinds of wrong. Now stop shaking." The cameraman wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Whenever you're ready," he said, calmer now. "Whenever you're ready, what?" said Harrison, leaning forward in his seat, the gun pointed down at the cameraman's midriff. "Whenever you're ready, Mr. President." Chapter 20. Hindsight. Anna Silverstone rocked back and forth. 1 minute she was up, the next she was down. It was the child's eyes that did it. All of the photos of him had been burned ever since the day he was taken. Anna managed to save one picture, however, but it too was burned to a point where only the eyes, nose, and mouth were visible. "I saved your life, child. I saved you." The eyes, nose, and mouth would not reply, just keep gazing. And Anna often wondered what he may have been thinking when the photograph was taken. Other times she wouldn't recognize him at all due to her own condition. Anna's husband had made for the border upon the birth of their only child. She could almost understand how something that both as a doctor and as a human being she found to be a violation of natural evolution could create something so terrifying, but still beautiful to her as a mother. The perversion that created the child that stared blankly at her in that moment had thankfully been merciful on the natural maternal instinct. After she learned, only in part, what her child was, what he would become, the trepidation was constant, like a throbbing pain in her gut. Pain she had partially cured when she was able to put one of her inventions to good use. An incubator, designed with a mechanical embryo casing, to act as an artificial womb for children born with defects that didn't show up in the first trimester scan, but were discovered too late in the pregnancy to prevent with other means. The risk was great, however. In order for the defects to be identified early enough to be corrected, forced early labor was a step that needed to be taken. They had no means of testing the full potential of the machine without experimenting on babies that were too little to breathe on their own. She had a rich father who had funded the engineering side of the project, while she, the brains, worked out all the scientific theory that would go into the engineering. Although she had never received approval for it to be used publicly, she was able to get it built and installed in a location known only to the installers, her father, and her. So, she had a device that she knew could work, and could shape the fortune of human evolution for the better. Not exactly making every human perfect, but preventing them from being worse in the eyes of society by adding or removing chromosomes and genes. Research into this innovation had been going on for several years, and it came to fruition with Anna's design. She had to make a choice when she looked down and saw the near-death condition of her newborn baby boy. Did she let him be at peace when he didn't even know what conflict was? Wasn't that the best gift you could give to a dying baby boy? A baby boy that you know, at first glance, no medical training required, is going to die in a matter of hours. Never know his parents, never make friends, never fall in love. Anna Silverstone was driven by her ideas and emotions, and her emotions told her she was going to deny her only child that gift. She was going to try and save his life. People might think that that was a good thing, but understanding what her son was, after that machine she had spent most of her life building held this inhuman disease at bay before finally shutting down due to overheating. That machine was designed to stay cool for a matter of months in order to ensure full growth, but this machine was overloaded by the cells in her baby's body, and deactivated itself in a matter of hours. The first thing that went through her mind when she saw the first spark of electricity wasn't that this machine had most likely failed to save her son. She had also lost her life's work. She would never get funding for a rebuild, and the selfishness of that thought haunted her to this day. Because, if she had never designed that thing, her child wouldn't be able to exist. None of them would be able to exist. Although the machine was overloaded, it was working at full capacity long enough for her child's heart to take over. A dark heart, both in colour and potential. Anna continued rocking as a new thought now haunted her, one that she would take to her grave. If she had never built that machine, therefore condemning her son to death, would that be so bad? Would the sight in front of her now, a sight that she could never unsee, have even existed if she hadn't been so damn clever? Still rocking, still crying, Anna's mind was cast back to when the birth of her little boy, an occasion that to Anna was drenched in nothing but close calls, abandonment, and blood, with a smattering of bitter success, was only the beginning. What was worse about this day in particular was that she should have known it was coming. Should have known, the way you just know it's time to go to sleep or wake up. But it was the bizarre form it took that caught her by surprise. A surprise that wormed its way into her brain, clawing at her then less synthetic pride as a mother. On this day she was sitting in her living room, a large open space, characterless and soulless, the walls mostly bare and white, the occasional potted plant, and a transparent glass coffee table that was almost as large as the boardroom table she sat at the head of every Thursday evening, a place that she felt she didn't deserve to be. The couch she was sitting on that day was comfortable, and the furry carpet below she was now curling her toes around, soft and warm. In her left hand she held a glass of chilled white wine that she would never let anyone take from her. In the other she held a spreadsheet that she had been staring at blankly for the past 10 minutes. She looked up at the ceiling, smiling slightly as she imagined her 12-year-old sleeping silently above. He had recently started sleeping a lot more, and had been complaining about what he described as growing pains in strange places. For years now, Anna had been drawing his blood weekly. It was just something Arkham was used to. He didn't question it, and Anna always thanked God silently for that. She had hoped that Arkham's tiredness was just that, tiredness. Lots of people, no matter what age, get tired sometimes, and there was a plethora of reasons why. That was scientific fact. But Anna knew, both as a mother, a doctor, and a general member of society, that that little boy up there, her little boy, was not normal, although he looked, sounded, and lived like he was. Anna could see that Arkham knew he was different, and was patiently waiting to have all the details explained to him. But that day was far off yet. Far, far off. She looked down at the spreadsheet again. Stapled underneath it were the results of the latest blood draws. Earlier she had compared the results of these latest ones with the ones she had taken weeks before. The results were vastly different. More and more cellular anomalies were forming in his blood. Too many for Anna to keep track of, or even categorize. No wonder he was so exhausted. She looked up at the ceiling again, wanting to stand up, make her way up the spiraled staircase and hold her son, tightly. But instead, she took another sip of her wine and looked back down at the spreadsheet. Anna was trying to be a good mother, but there were so many things in flux, especially at the moment, with all of the physical changes that the paper she was holding told her that her son was undergoing. She didn't know what the next logical step could be. She was also trying not to think about what was going to happen 5 years from that day, but she couldn't help it, and began to suddenly shudder violently. Anna was on various medications to help cope with her stress. Not all of it was related to her son, but the weekly blood draws were beginning to take their toll. Every time she was finished, she had to remind herself why she was doing it in the first place. For him. The man in charge. The fact that he had instructed her, on pain of death, not hers, to give away as little information about her son's condition as possible was hard enough, but the worst thing was having to do it all by herself. This didn't mean that she longed for Arkham's father to return and help lighten the load. Anna despised Arkham's father completely for so many different reasons, but she did need help from someone. A thought occurred to her at that moment. Maybe by being more honest with her son, she would find it would help her own sanity, being able to share and talk about all the bizarre things that were happening, both to him and to the outside world. Obviously, she was more concerned about the former than the latter, but there was so much she didn't know about this world and the people in it. The man in charge had done a good job over the years of chipping away at her already badly bruised ego. She didn't know what was real and what wasn't half the time. More than half the time. A lot more. Yes, she was a doctor, a successful one too. And when she was in her prime, she had also been happy. When her incubation device was in the development stage, it had been the busiest and happiest time of her life. Now she felt like she was back in college, collecting information from one of her professors for some kind of weird experiment. But that experiment was her son. Yes, she decided it was time to be honest with him. She downed 2 diazepam, 5 milligrams each, and stood up. She could feel her legs shaking. She grabbed onto the arm of the couch for support, knocking the remote control onto the floor, button side down. The TV that all her furniture was pointed towards came on. This gave her a fright, which sent her back down into the chair, almost as if the TV was forcing her to watch, as if it didn't want her to move.
"We don't want you to move, Anna,"
came a voice, slow and guttural. Anna's heart sped up. Who said that? Only she and Arkham lived in this house, and she didn't know anybody with a voice like that. The accent was American, but she couldn't put her finger on a state.
"The state doesn't matter, Anna,"
said the voice again. She stood up quickly, panicking, looking around the room for the source of the sound. And then she froze as her eyes were about to glaze over the television screen. The voice was coming from the surround sound speakers. "What the hell?" she said, her words almost dying in the back of her throat.
"You mustn't tell him, Anna. Your son must remain ignorant until the time is right."
Anna moved closer to the screen, the rest of her body joining in with her quivering legs. The TV had flashed onto the 24-hour news channel, and it was the anchor who was talking. "How is this possible?" she stammered, extremely tempted to pull her crushed pack of cigarettes from the back of her pocket and light one, but she decided against it. She was just seeing things. That was all, just seeing things.
"Go ahead, Anna, smoke away. It's not the lung cancer that's gonna kill you."
I don't have lung cancer," Anna said, somehow taking issue with the point the anchor was making rather than the fact that he was talking to her through her own television. His suit was a faded sky blue and stained, along with his teeth. The collar of his white shirt was stained with something red, and there was an enormous vertical scar running straight down the middle of his face, from hairline to chin, as if someone had cut and pulled the man's face apart, only to stitch it back up again, and badly.
"Apologies,"
said the man.
"I am aware that visually I'm tricky."
That's an understatement, Anna said, inwardly.
"That's a rude thing to say, a rude thing to think, Anna Silverstone. I am not impressed."
"Can you hear?" Anna's question trailed off. She wasn't sure if she wanted an answer. Was she seeing things? She must be. It was the pills. That was the only explanation. The anchor's next words answered both of her questions, and in that moment, she had never felt more fear in her entire life.
"You've only just taken the diazepam, Anna. Only 5 mils each. That's not enough to make you crazy. So you must not be crazy."
"What the hell is going on?" Anna said, almost crumpling to the floor in terror. This is impossible."
"I am here to keep you from making an irreversible mistake. It's not time for your son to know."
"Who decided it wasn't time?" Anna said, suddenly feeling a surge of rage that someone would dare tell her how to raise her own son.
"You know who decided it wasn't time, Anna. You know."
That was when it hit her in a huge, terrifying rush. It had been a while since she had heard from the man in charge. Usually, she would just send the results away to some anonymous email address, and would then receive an automated reply saying that it had been received and recorded. Was this his new way of torturing her? Making her own TV tell her how to raise her child?
"It may be unorthodox, Anna, but it is necessary. And what's more, it seems to be working."
"What are you talking about?"
You've already decided in your head that you're not going to tell your son. You are going to do what we tell you to do. And right now, and for the next couple of years, maybe even the next few years, you will say nothing.
Who's we? Anna asked, choosing not to argue with the anchor's point, because he was right. He was right. Had he just made that decision for her?
You know who we are, Anna. We're everywhere. And we are always watching you.
Anna's breathing began to spiral out of control. She was on all fours now, her head rising and falling, shaking, staining the floor with tears. The camera began to slowly zoom in on the anchor's horrible face, his widening eyes piercing Anna's soul, stabbing it with nothing but passion and enthusiasm.
Always watching,
the man said. He smiled at her then, and it was the smile that had pushed her over the edge. She would never be the same after that. Everything she did from that day forward was carried out as if this man, this horrible man, was looking over her shoulder, smiling and whispering, using her name at the end of almost every sentence for dramatic effect. The only thing that calmed her down, in the slightest, was the hope that, if she did what the man said, a man who represented an even more terrifying prospect, she would never have to see him again. And as that memory faded, and Anna was brought back to the present, she opened her eyes and smiled. Smiled the way the anchor had smiled at her on that day, almost laughing at how ignorant she had been, thinking that they were just going to leave her alone. "Ignorance is bliss," she said, still rocking, still